The crystal chandelier hummed faintly when my father lifted his glass. Light fractured over polished wood, scattering gold across a crowd that smiled in all the right places. To Stephanie, he said, voice warm, practiced, a home built on excellence. Applause rose like steam. My sister's hand rested in her husband's. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye. I stood at the edge of the room, holding a flute I hadn't tasted, invisible inside the family photograph that didn't need me to complete it. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who call you family and still felt unseen, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you know what it means to be compared until you disappear, hit that like button and share this story with someone who'll understand. But to see why that toast still echoes in my mind, you have to know how long I'd been hearing the same song. I grew up in a colonial house outside Boston, where everything gleamed floors, grades, reputations. My mother, the dean of humanities, arranged life like a syllabus. My father, a neurosurgeon, spoke in precise terms of achievement. Theirs was a language of milestones. Stephanie learned it fluently. By 12, she painted her room navy because it feels scholarly. Every certificate on her wall was leveled with a ruler. My world was color movement imperfection. I spent nights sketching faces, experimenting with light, chasing something that couldn't be graded. My parents called it a hobby. They called Stephanie gifted. At 16, I won a statewide art competition. I remember standing alone on that stage, under white-hot lights, the blue ribbon trembling in my hand. I imagined my parents in the audience. They weren't. They'd chosen Stephanie's debate championship instead. That night, I placed the ribbon on the dinner table between the roasted chicken and my mother's smile. "That's nice, dear," she said. "Did you finish your calculus homework?" The ribbon's dye bled a faint streak onto the wood. I wiped it away before dessert. College applications became the next contest. I submitted portfolios to art schools. They countered with pre-med programs. When I was accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design, my father folded the letter once, twice. "We can't fund an impractical degree," he said gently, as though compassion softened control. Meanwhile, every expense of Stephanie's Ivy League medical training was covered without question. So I worked. 3 jobs, 1 dream. Morning coffee shifts, evening gallery hours, weekend internships. I learned that survival has a sound. The hiss of milk steaming, the click of a register drawer, the scratch of a pencil in a midnight apartment. Sleep was optional. Pride was not. Years later, when a creative director named Amelia looked over my designs and said, "You have a voice worth listening to," I felt something unclench. Under her mentorship, I built a portfolio, landed clients, and eventually a campaign that splashed across Michigan Avenue. Communication Arts printed my name. From my parents' silence. From my sister, a text dad showed me an article about some advertising award you won. "Congrats!" 5 words of recognition, one for each year I'd spent proving I existed. By 29, I'd built enough to buy a small Chicago loft, brick walls, tall windows, the smell of possibility. I signed the closing papers alone, then walked home through light rain. That key in my palm felt heavier than any diploma. I didn't tell my family. The moment was too sacred to hand over for grading. When I did see them again, it was at Christmas. Stephanie had just purchased her 5-bedroom house in Brookline. My parents glowed with secondhand triumph, talking equity architecture grandchildren. I smiled past the dessert and tasted the same quiet salt that always followed their praise. The invitation to her housewarming arrived in thick cream cardstock, engraved and scented faintly of roses. I ran my fingers over the raised letters before I realized what I was doing. Of course I would go. Hope can be stubborn that way. The house was perfect, the kind of symmetry that makes photographers sigh. Inside every vase, every drape, every flower petal had a purpose. When Stephanie spotted me, She smiled the way people do when they've already guessed your outfit. "You look colorful," she said. My jumpsuit was cobalt blue. Against the beige crowd, it felt like rebellion. Guests rotated politely. "You're the artist's sister?" one asked. Another leaned closer. "You make logos, right?" My mother, leading me into a circle of her colleagues, announced, "Monica's here from Chicago, always busy with her little projects." Then she turned back to discuss Stephanie's latest medical publication. When the toast came, my father's voice filled the room, steady, assured, proud. "Diana and I couldn't be prouder of Stephanie's accomplishments," he said. "She's built a life on discipline and vision." Each phrase landed like a nail sealing a box. He never said my name. I excused myself, found the quietest room, Stephanie's office. Her framed degrees lined the wall, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Boston Memorial. Family photos filled the shelves, each one a variation on perfection. Stephanie between our parents, Stephanie in white coats, Stephanie beside a ribbon-cutting mayor. Not one included me. I felt the same silence that used to fill our dinner table. It pressed against my ribs. Downstairs, laughter swelled. I set my empty glass on her desk and caught my reflection in the window shoulder's squared face. Composed eyes that had finally learned the shape of being unseen. I slipped my coat from the rack and stepped into the night. Snow had begun to fall, soft and symmetrical. The air smelled clean, indifferent. Behind me, through curtained light, glasses lifted again. Ahead, the drive curved toward darkness and the sound of tires whispering over frost. When my ride arrived, the driver glanced at me in the mirror. "Long night." "Long enough," I said. Back in Chicago the next morning, my building's doorman greeted me by name. My apartment opened into warmth and the faint scent of coffee beans from the cafe downstairs. The silence here didn't erase me, it recognized me. Still, the echo of my father's toast lingered like a splinter beneath the skin. I stood by the window, looking out over the city, the glass cold against my fingertips. Somewhere between Boston and home, something in me had shifted, small, certain, irreversible. I didn't know it yet, but that night marked the end of performing for their applause. The next chapter would begin in the quiet, where no one was clapping, and where I would finally hear my own voice. The city was still gray with late winter light when I got back from Boston. Steam rose from the pavement near the river, soft and silver against the chill. I walked home from the station instead of taking a cab. The air felt cleaner after all that quiet pretending, and each step pressed away the echo of my father's toast. Inside, the loft smelled faintly of coffee and varnished wood. My plants bent toward the window, alive and unbothered. I slipped off my boots, poured a glass of water, and stood for a long time by the window, watching the slow line of headlights below. The world outside kept moving, indifferent but somehow kind in its constancy. It was strange how solitude could hold more warmth than family sometimes. For a few days, I worked in silence. Projects stacked up, branding for a small bookstore, a brochure for an environmental nonprofit, revisions for a returning client. Routine steadied me. Mornings began with espresso and music low enough to hum through the walls. Evenings ended with long walks along the lake, the kind that reset your thoughts without asking questions. But something shifted inside me after that trip. It wasn't bitterness, just the understanding that I could stop waiting for their applause. That realization had a quiet weight, like a stone settling into its rightful place. I decided to mark it somehow. Not for them, but for me. It came to me one evening while sketching new layouts on the kitchen island. I'd never really celebrated buying this apartment. I'd signed the papers alone, carried the keys home, and slipped into life as if it were no big event. But it was. That space had become proof of what I could build on my own terms. I decided to host a housewarming, belated, a year late but honest. It wouldn't be a show of success or a competition. I wanted to fill my home with laughter, conversation, and people who knew me beyond my resume. The idea grew roots before I could second guess it. The next morning, I sent out digital invitations with a hand-drawn illustration of my building. I invited friends from work clients who had become confidants and neighbors who shared coffee and conversation in the lobby. I left my family off the list. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I wanted to spend one evening free from comparison where every question came from genuine curiosity and not polite performance. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into preparation. On weekends, I installed floating bookshelves I'd designed myself. I hung the vintage textile I'd found in Mexico, its worn edges carrying stories older than my apartment. A friend from a local gallery helped me mount a series of black and white photographs I'd taken over the years, moments of light falling across forgotten corners of the city. For food, I partnered with an old client who had started a catering company that specialized in international street food. We planned small, colorful stations instead of a sit-down dinner. A friend who worked as a mixologist offered to create signature cocktails, each named after a design movement, modernist mule Bauhaus bloom deco twist. Every detail felt like a piece of me stitched into the fabric of the night. On the day of the party, rain fell lightly across the city, washing the air clean. By 7, the first guests began to arrive, umbrellas dripping in the hallway, coats slung over the backs of chairs. The space came alive with the hum of conversation, the scent of ginger and cilantro, the soft notes of a jazz record spinning near the kitchen. Amelia, my mentor, walked in carrying a vintage design book she'd found in a second-hand shop. Inside the cover, she'd written for Monica, who sees beauty others overlook. I didn't expect the lump in my throat, but it came anyway. Friends mingled easily, my yoga instructor deep in conversation with one of my clients, 2 former classmates, comparing stories about difficult bosses, and artists from my building sharing travel tales with a tech consultant. The mix felt effortless. It was the kind of energy that comes only when no one is performing. Midway through the night, Jackson, a photographer friend, clinked his glass to call for attention. To Monica, he said, "Who builds beauty out of honesty and never takes the easy path?" Laughter rippled around the room. And to this space, which feels more alive than any gallery I've been in this year. I looked around and saw faces glowing in candlelight, people who had walked beside me through failures and small victories. My chest ached in that good way, full but not heavy. This was belonging, I realized, not earned through titles or approval, but built one honest connection at a time. When the last guest left near 2 in the morning, the apartment was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping against the glass. I sat on the window seat with a blanket over my knees, surrounded by flowers and empty glasses. City lights scattered across the wet streets below, turning every puddle into a mirror. I didn't take photos right away. I just let the stillness settle around me. The silence felt nothing like loneliness. It felt complete. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows, soft and golden. I made tea in a handmade mug I'd bought from a potter in Santa Fe and opened my camera roll. The photos from the night told the story better than words: friends laughing in my kitchen, someone sketching on a napkin, a group dancing barefoot in the hallway. I created an album titled Home. Later, I posted a few pictures online with a short caption, "Grateful for 1 year in this space and for everyone who's made it feel like home." I knew my family would see it. They always did. But for the first time, I didn't post for their acknowledgement. I posted because the happiness felt real enough to share. In the quiet that followed, I noticed a shift in how I carried myself. When clients praised my work, I said thank you instead of deflecting. When my parents called about holidays, I no longer exaggerated the scale of my projects to earn their respect. I spoke plainly. It was subtle, but freeing, like taking off shoes that never fit. Weeks passed. Chicago leaned into spring, and the air smelled of thawing earth and rain. Work grew busy again. One afternoon, as I was reviewing proofs for a museum catalog, my phone lit up with my mother's name. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Her voice was smoother than I expected. "Monica, darling, I'm going to be in Chicago next week for a conference. I thought we might have dinner, just the two of us. It's been too long." I could almost picture her sitting at her desk calendar, open pen in hand, every gesture practiced. Still, something about her tone was gentler than before. "That would be fine," I said, careful but calm. We settled on Thursday. She suggested a restaurant overlooking Michigan Avenue, the kind that served small plates and quiet prestige. I agreed, marking it in my calendar with the same composure I used for client meetings. When the evening arrived, Chicago surprised me with unseasonable warmth. The lake breeze felt soft against my skin. I dressed with thought, a pair of wide-leg trousers, a teal blazer, earrings from a local artist. Confidence, not costume. At the restaurant, she was already seated reading the wine list with the focus of someone scanning a contract. She rose to greet me with the familiar Air Kisses faint perfume trailing behind her. "You look well," she said. "That color is bold." I smiled, sliding into the seat across from her. "Thank you. It's one of my favorites." The waiter appeared. She ordered a glass of Chardonnay without asking my preference. I requested a sparkling water and watched the flicker of surprise cross her face. Small, but telling. We spoke first of safe topics: her presentation, the new dean appointed at her university, the weather's odd behavior. I told her about a recent campaign I'd completed for an environmental nonprofit. She nodded politely, the way she might during a faculty meeting, then steered the conversation toward familiar ground. "Your sister's doing wonderfully," she began. "They finished the landscaping on their new place." "It's becoming quite beautiful." "That's nice," I said, tearing a piece of bread. "A garden changes everything." "They're planning a dinner for Thomas's department chair next month. She's really taken to hosting." She sipped her wine, eyes steady. "And what about you, dear? Still busy with work?" "My business is growing," I said. "I've hired a junior designer." "That's nice, but I meant personally. 32 is an age to think about settling down." Her tone was light, but the words landed in the old familiar way, subtle judgment wrapped in concern. The waiter cleared our plates, and I let the silence breathe. Then I said, "I'm content with where I am. I date when I meet someone interesting, but I'm not measuring happiness by anyone else's timeline." She blinked, surprised. "That's very modern." A pause. "Family is what matters in the end." I looked at her carefully. Her pearls caught the light, her posture perfect. Yet something in her eyes softened, almost uncertain. "Family matters when it's built on understanding," I said quietly. Her hand froze on the stem of her glass. "Your sister's housewarming was so lovely," she said finally, like someone returning to safer territory. "When are you going to catch up?" That sentence, gentle, practiced, utterly familiar, felt like every dismissal wrapped into one. But this time, something inside me didn't retreat. I set down my fork, met her gaze, and spoke evenly. "I hosted mine last year. You just weren't on the guest list." For a moment, the restaurant noise faded. Her face shifted, surprise first, then confusion, then something like hurt. The air between us thickened heavy with everything unsaid. I didn't elaborate. The truth didn't need embroidery. It just needed space. She searched my face as if trying to recognize me. Then she looked down, adjusting the corner of her napkin. "You never mentioned a housewarming." "No," I said softly. "I didn't." The clink of silverware from nearby tables filled the silence that followed, and I felt an odd calm settle in. Not triumph, something quieter, steadier. I had finally stopped asking to be seen. Outside, The city lights shimmered through the windows, reflections gliding across her glass of wine. I knew this was only the beginning of a conversation that would take years to finish, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to start it. My mother's fork hovered midair, as if the weight of what I'd just said stopped her hand. The hum of conversation from nearby tables faded into the soft clatter of plates and the muted rhythm of background music. Her lips parted, but no words followed. The silence between us felt larger than the table, larger than all the years that had led us here. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the practiced gentleness of someone accustomed to control. "You never mentioned a housewarming, Monica." I let out a slow breath. "That's right," I said. "I celebrated with people who actually see me for who I am." Her expression shifted, confusion softening into something closer to disbelief. "That's ridiculous. Of course we value you." "Being valued and being known aren't the same thing," I replied. I kept my tone even though I could feel the pulse in my throat. "When was the last time you asked about my work without comparing it to Stephanie's? Or the last time you showed interest in what makes me happy instead of what you think should?" She blinked as if the questions themselves were foreign. "We've always supported both our daughters equally." I gave a faint smile. "You helped Stephanie buy her house, Mom. You've never even been to mine." Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. The waiter approached to clear our plates, sensing the tension, and quickly retreated. "It's not about money," I said quietly. "It's about respect. It's about seeing me." She took a slow sip of wine, eyes fixed on her glass. For a moment, she seemed smaller somehow, like the roles we'd always played were slipping. "I didn't realize you felt that way," she murmured. "Because you never asked," I said. My voice came out softer than I expected. "And because I never felt safe enough to tell you." The air between us stilled again. I saw her looking down the way she used to when I was a child, and she didn't have an answer she liked. Her napkin lay crumpled beside the untouched dessert she'd ordered out of habit. After a moment, she spoke almost to herself. "I suppose I've been proud in my own way. Maybe too focused on keeping everything perfect." The flicker of humility in her voice was something I had never heard before. But decades of silence don't dissolve in a single dinner. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and said I should go. "I have an early client meeting." She raised her hand quickly. "Please let me take care of it." She reached for the check as if it were the only peace offering she could give. "Good night, Mom," I said softly. "Have a safe flight home." Outside, the city felt warmer than the restaurant had. The night breeze brushed my face as I walked, each step loosening something that had been bound for too long. Streetlights shimmered on the damp pavement, and the scent of rain hung in the air. I walked the 15 blocks home instead of calling a cab, letting the rhythm of my footsteps calm me. By the time I reached my building, I felt lighter. Not happy, but clean, like air after a storm. Over the next few days, I ignored the string of missed calls that began appearing on my phone. Her voicemails followed a pattern I knew too well: confusion, defensiveness, and finally frustration. "You're being dramatic," she said in one message. "We've always wanted the best for you," in another. And then, more sharply, "This is exactly why we worry about your choices." I listened to them once, then let them sit there. I didn't feel anger, only distance. For once, I wasn't scrambling to explain myself. A week later, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months: Stephanie. My first instinct was hesitation, but I answered anyway. Her voice sounded different, low, careful. "Hey, do you have a minute?" "Sure," I said. Is everything okay? Mother told me about your dinner, she said, or rather, her version of it. I wanted to hear yours. I leaned against the window, the city stretching beneath me in amber light. I told her the truth, I said, that I felt invisible for most of my life, that I'm done pretending otherwise. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear her breathing. Then softly, I'm sorry. The word caught me off guard. Not for what you said, she continued, for the fact that it's true. I sat down on the edge of the couch. Her voice carried a fatigue I hadn't noticed before. I've always known how they treat you, she said, but I didn't know how to stop it. They put so much pressure on me to be perfect, it's exhausting. Every time I thought I'd earned a rest, they found another bar to reach. Sometimes I wish I could walk away from all of it. Her confession hit harder than I expected. You never said that before, I whispered. I couldn't, she said. They don't see me either, not really. They see the version they built. The line went quiet. I could hear her exhale. At least you built your own life, Monica. I don't even know if mine belongs to me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The years of competition our parents had cultivated hung between us thin and brittle as glass. Then I said, maybe we both deserve a new start. Not as the versions they raised us to be, but as ourselves. She let out a small laugh, half weary, half relieved. That sounds nice. We talked for 45 minutes that night, the longest conversation we'd had in years. Not about accomplishments or milestones, but about ordinary things, her long hours at the hospital, the books I'd been reading, the way we both missed our grandmother's kitchen. When we hung up, my chest felt lighter. There was a small bridge between us now, fragile, but real. 2 days later, a letter arrived in the mail with my mother's handwriting across the envelope. I hesitated before opening it, unsure what tone it would take. Inside were 3 pages of her personal stationery, the ink uneven, the sentences rewritten and crossed out. That alone told me she'd struggled. She began with words I'd never expected. Your honesty at dinner forced me to look at myself in a way I haven't before. She admitted that her constant comparisons were an attempt to push me toward what she considered safe and respectable, that she'd never truly understood the cost. I've measured success so narrowly that I missed the beauty of yours, she wrote. I focused on what you weren't instead of who you are. I reread that line several times. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was the first time she'd ever named the truth without deflecting. The letter ended with a request. She wanted to try family therapy, something to help us understand one another, before more years slipped by. For a while, I just sat there, the paper warm from my hands. I thought about the quiet after dinner, the rain on the street. Her small, uncertain voice saying she hadn't realized. Maybe this was her way of trying. A week later, my father called. The conversation was awkward, halting. Your mother shared what you discussed, he said. I'd like to understand too. I don't always see where things went wrong. It was as close to an admission as he could manage, but it was enough. Thank you, Dad, I said. That means a lot. 2 months later, I found myself in a softly lit office in Boston, seated across from Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, the therapist my parents had chosen. My parents sat on one side, Stephanie beside them. I chose a chair opposite, angled slightly toward the window. The first session was heavy. My mother filled the air with explanations. My father responded with logic and restraint. Stephanie tried to play mediator. I listened, feeling old habits trying to pull me back into silence. Dr. Jenkins eventually stopped the flow of voices with calm precision. I've noticed that when Monica begins to share, everyone else moves to correct or explain, she said. Let's try something different. Each person gets time to speak without interruption. When my turn came, I took a breath that felt like it had waited years to be released. I spoke about the years of invisibility, the constant measuring against someone else's reflection, the exhaustion of trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. My father looked startled. My mother pressed a tissue to her eyes. Stephanie sat quietly nodding. By the end of that session, the air in the room felt thinner, fragile, but breathable. Dr. Jenkins suggested we continue remotely monthly calls, occasional in-person sessions. No one protested. The months that followed were slow and uneven. Old habits crept back easily, but for the first time, my parents noticed when they did. My mother would pause mid-sentence, catch herself comparing, and say, "I'm sorry, I'm doing it again." My father began sending me articles about design thinking, not as persuasion, but as curiosity. Even Stephanie and I found new rhythm. Sunday calls every other week just to talk. Some ended awkwardly. Others lasted hours. She told me once, half laughing, "It feels strange learning how to be sisters in our 30s. I smiled. Maybe we're just doing it right this time. The last of winter slipped quietly into spring. I was sitting at my desk one afternoon when an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. The subject line read simply, a question. Inside, she wrote, "We'd like to visit this summer. Maybe see your home, meet the people in your life if you'd be comfortable." I read it twice before answering. "Yes," I wrote. "I'd like that." After sending it, I leaned back in my chair and looked around my apartment. The afternoon light poured through the tall windows, warming the brick walls and the photographs that told my story. For the first time, the idea of letting them see this space, my world, didn't feel frightening. It felt right. Outside, the city hummed in its usual rhythm, unhurried and alive. Somewhere in that sound was the beginning of something new. The path ahead wasn't certain, but it was open, and that was enough for now. Summer came early that year, the kind that softened the air and made the city smell faintly of lilacs and rain on pavement. The invitation I'd sent to my parents and to Stephanie had been written carefully, short, warm, without expectations. I told them I was planning a small gathering, part anniversary, part celebration, for how much my business had grown. I wanted them to see the life I had built, not through explanation, but through presence. They arrived an hour early, traveling together from Boston. My mother stepped out of the car first, dressed in linen, her hair pinned the way she always wore it when she needed composure. My father followed, carrying a small box tied with ribbon. Stephanie trailed behind, calm and smiling in that gentle way that had become new to both of us. "Your building's lovely," my mother said, glancing up at the old brick facade. "It has character." "It does," I said. "It's why I chose it." Inside, the apartment glowed in the late afternoon light. The windows stretched high, catching the skyline, and the air carried the scent of fresh flowers and something baking Amelia had insisted on sending her favorite lemon cake as a gift. My mother stopped just past the doorway, scanning the room in quiet surprise. She moved slowly, her hand brushing the edge of a bookshelf, then resting on the frame of one of my photographs. "You took this?" she asked. "All of them," I said. "They're pieces from different campaigns and personal projects." My father walked toward the framed poster of my first major design, the sustainable fashion campaign that had changed everything for me. He studied it for a long moment. "You designed this entire concept?" "Yes," I said. "It raised their market share by 22%. He nodded, his expression, unreadable at first, then softened into something that looked like genuine curiosity. "That's impressive," he said quietly. I hadn't realized creativity and business could work so closely together. Their words didn't erase the years of silence, but they added something new to the air, an opening. Guests began arriving soon after. The room filled with laughter, voices mingling, glasses clinking. My friends moved easily through the space, introducing themselves, talking about art design, travel food. My creative director, a client from an environmental nonprofit, and a couple of neighbors I'd grown close to, all blending, as if they'd known each other for years. I watched my parents move among them, listening more than speaking. They stood near the window, taking in the skyline, nodding, as people spoke about my work, hearing things from others that I could never have said for myself. Stephanie floated easily, asking questions, laughing with my friends, her posture lighter than I remembered. At one point, I saw my mother by the kitchen island, her hands folded, her eyes scanning the room. She looked still. When I joined her, she turned her face softer than I'd ever seen it. "Your home is beautiful," she said. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "It's so clearly you." "Thank you," I said. She looked around again before continuing. "I'm beginning to understand what I missed trying to fit you into a life that wasn't yours. You've built something remarkable here. Not just the work, but the people, the warmth. It's alive." I felt a quiet ache rise behind my ribs, the kind that comes when something finally begins to heal. "It took me a long time to see it," I said. "But I like the life I've built." She nodded. "I can see that now." The moment didn't erase everything, but it marked something new. For the first time, I felt her seeing me, not the shadow of her expectations, but the person standing right in front of her. Later, as dusk deepened, the conversation flowed to the balcony. Lights from the buildings shimmered like quiet fires in the glass. Stephanie leaned beside me, her wine untouched, watching the city stretch out below. "Do you remember when we were little?" she said. "How we used to sneak into the guest room and make up stories about who lived there before us?" I laughed. "You always made them doctors or scientists, and you made them painters," she said, smiling. "You always imagined color on the walls." For a moment, we stood in the easy silence of old memory, the kind that doesn't demand apology. "I'm glad you invited us," she said. "I know that couldn't have been simple." "It wasn't," I admitted. "But I wanted you here." She touched my arm lightly. "It feels like a new start." Inside, my father was telling one of my clients about a surgical innovation project, and my mother was laughing softly with Amelia. I hadn't expected laughter from her. It was a quiet sound, but it filled the room. When the evening began to slow, people left in pairs, exchanging hugs and promises to meet again soon. My parents stayed until the end, helping me clear glasses, folding napkins, the kind of domestic rhythm we had never shared before. My mother paused by the hallway leading to my office. "May I?" she asked. "Of course." The room was smaller, framed by shelves and corkboards filled with sketches and early drafts of projects. She ran her fingers over the edge of a shelf where I kept a few of my awards, small plaques from design associations, a crystal cube engraved with my name. "You've never mentioned these," she said softly. "You never asked," I answered. Not unkindly, just simply true. She turned eyes meeting mine. "I'm asking now." It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was real. After they left for their hotel, the apartment felt unusually quiet. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the taillights fade down the street. The night carried that calm weight cities have after company leaves, soft, reflective, alive with afterglow. I thought about the years I had spent trying to be visible in their world, and how tonight they had finally stepped into mine. It wasn't victory. It was peace, the kind that comes when understanding replaces performance. Stephanie had hugged me before leaving. "Worth doing," she'd said, and she was right. I looked around my home, the bookshelves I'd built, the art on the walls, the table still littered with the signs of laughter. Everything felt in its rightful place. For a moment, I thought of that night in Boston, standing in Stephanie's perfect living room, invisible. and how far that silence had carried me into color light and life of my own making. Outside, the city was quiet now. The hum of traffic had thinned, and a soft wind pressed against the glass. I turned off the lamps, leaving only the light from the skyline. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, emails, clients, another round of projects. But something essential had changed. The people who once defined my worth had finally begun to see the world I'd created without them. I stood there for a long while, hands resting on the window frame, until the sky over the lake began to pale. It was the same view I saw every morning, but that night it looked different, like a horizon instead of a boundary. Morning sunlight spread across my apartment in slow gold bands, turning the floor into warm amber glass. The city outside was waking up distant traffic, a delivery truck rumbling below the faint murmur of someone's radio playing old jazz. Inside, everything felt still. Cups and plates from the night before sat neatly stacked in the sink. A half-empty vase of tulips leaned toward the window. The quiet carried that tender weight of something finished, not lost, just settled. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, the mug warm between my hands. Across the street, a mother and child walked toward the park, the boy swinging his backpack like a pendulum. It made me think about the strange passage of years, the time we spend trying to prove ourselves, and how peace only begins when that trying stops. My phone vibrated on the counter, a text from Stephanie. "We made it home safely. Mom keeps talking about your lemon cake and your photographs. Dad says he wants to see the gallery when it opens next month." "Proud of you, sis." I smiled. The words were simple, but they held something real. No competition, no polished tone, just truth between sisters. I typed back, "Thank you. Tell them I'm glad they came." It meant more than I could say. After sending it, I took another sip of coffee and let my mind drift to the evening before the sight of my father examining one of my framed prints with quiet respect. My mother touching the edge of a ceramic bowl as though it were a delicate discovery, Stephanie laughing freely in my kitchen. None of it had been perfect, but it didn't need to be. It had been human, and that was enough. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice held a calm I wasn't used to. "I've been thinking about your home," she said. "I keep seeing the way the light fell across your shelves. You've created something truly beautiful, Monica." I leaned against my desk, smiling faintly. "Thank you, Mom. I wish I had understood sooner," she said quietly. All those years, I was so focused on what the world expected from us that I forgot to look at who my daughters actually were. Her words lingered. For once, I didn't rush to soothe her. I let her honesty stand on its own. "We're learning," I said gently. "That's what matters." She exhaled a long sound that almost carried relief. "You were right to say those things at dinner," she admitted. It hurt to hear them, but they needed to be said. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The woman who once measured love in achievements was finally speaking in humility. "I appreciate that," I said softly. "Truly." When we hung up, I sat by the window again and watched the shadows shift across the buildings. Forgiveness didn't arrive like a clean break. It came in layers, quiet and uneven. But it was happening. In the weeks that followed, our therapy sessions continued, though they felt different now. Less defensive, more curious. My father, who once filled silence with explanations, began asking questions instead. He wanted to understand what design meant to me, not just as work, but as expression. I showed him sketches of a new campaign I was developing, and he nodded with an almost childlike fascination. "It's like surgery in color," he said once. "Precision and creativity working together." My mother smiled at that comparison. "Exactly, James," she said. "Our daughter performs her own kind of healing." Stephanie and I began our Sunday calls with less caution. Sometimes we talked about our projects, sometimes about movies or recipes or nothing in particular. One evening, she told me she and Thomas were considering volunteering for a children's art program at the hospital. "You were right about creative expression," she said. "It helps people breathe again." I felt something loosen inside me at those words, a thread of shared understanding weaving through years of distance. By early autumn, the air had changed again. Chicago's sky turned deeper, and evenings carried that early chill that made windows fog from the inside. Work kept me busy, but I noticed how different life felt now. My days weren't spent proving anything. Each project, each new client, came from a place of quiet assurance rather than survival. One Friday, after finishing a presentation, I walked to the lakefront just before sunset. The wind smelled of damp leaves and iron from the water. I sat on a bench, my sketchbook open, but I didn't draw. Instead, I watched the horizon where the sky shifted from blue to gold to a bruised violet. I thought about how much life can change when you stop fighting for permission to exist in your own shape. I didn't need their validation anymore, but still, it mattered that they were trying. It mattered that I could stand beside them without shrinking. That was the quiet victory I never saw coming. Later that month, I received an envelope in the mail, a photograph of my family standing in my apartment during the gathering. My mother had written a note on the back in her elegant handwriting. "Your father printed this." He said it was the first picture that felt complete. I held the photo for a long time, tracing the edges. There we were, Stephanie beside me, my parents near the window, the city stretching behind us. The expressions weren't polished or posed. They were real. That night, I framed it and placed it on the shelf beside one of my art books. It didn't replace the old memories, but it gave them a place to rest. When Thanksgiving came, I flew to Boston for the first time in 3 years. The house looked smaller than I remembered. My mother greeted me at the door, apron dusted with flour. My father carved the turkey with surgical precision while humming an old jazz tune. Stephanie set the table with mismatched dishes, laughing when our mother pretended to object. There were small moments, quiet, ordinary, perfect in their imperfection. My mother complimented my salad dressing. My father asked if I would design a flyer for his hospital fundraiser. At one point, Stephanie handed me her phone to show a picture of a mural she'd helped paint in a children's wing. "The kids picked the colors," she said proudly. "You'd love it." And I did. I loved all of it, the ordinary warmth that once seemed impossible. After dinner, we stood outside beneath a sky pricked with stars. The air smelled of pine and smoke. My mother slipped her arm through mine. "You know," she said softly, "this might be the first time our family feels balanced." "Maybe because we finally stopped performing," I said. She laughed quietly, the sound like the rustle of leaves. "Yes," she said, and started listening. When I flew back to Chicago the next morning, the city welcomed me with its familiar chill. I unlocked my door and stepped into my apartment, sunlight spilling through the tall windows. The framed family photo caught the light just right, casting a soft reflection on the opposite wall. I stood there for a moment, taking it in the life I had built, the peace I had chosen, the love that no longer demanded proof. My home felt fuller now, not because of new things, but because of the space left behind by what I'd finally released. I brewed another cup of coffee, opened the windows to the cool air, and sat down at my desk. Outside, the city moved with its steady rhythm, cars' voices, the rustle of early leaves. I opened my sketchbook and began to draw, not for a client or a deadline, but for myself. The lines came easily, the colors sure. For the first time, I realized how deeply I had stopped waiting to be seen. I was simply living, doing, creating, breathing in the life that once felt so far away. The morning light shifted slowly across the page, turning the pencil strokes to silver. I looked out at the skyline and felt a quiet gratitude for everything that had brought me here. The hurt, the distance, the work, and finally, the peace. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive. They fade because we finally stop needing them to explain who we are. If this story touched something in you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever found peace by standing in your own truth, I'd love to know. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose calm over approval and build a life that finally feels like yours.